Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Bottom Line. I'm your host, Lauren Kalil. Our show is brought to you by Vuori. I have an unhealthy amount of joggers, but Vuori's performance joggers, they take the cake as the softest, most comfortable ones I have. Check out the description below for 20% off of your first purchase. On today's episode, we have our sports analysts back. We have Brian Friend, Tommy Marquez, and Patrick Clark here to reveal their early contenders for most improved at the CrossFit Games. Each analyst, they picked a different athlete, whether it was a female or a male. They just had to pick one. But before we get into the specific picks, what really goes into deciding this and crowning someone is the most improved?
Well, you have to pan Brian's camera just a little bit to his left because he's got a Rube Goldberg machine that he puts in a single cat's eye marble, and then after a 20-minute process of whirs and buzzes and bleeps, it kicks out a piece of paper. It
kicks out Colton Mertens.
Yes. and then you have your most improved.
No, we already know what Brian's pick is.
No, that's the Goldberg machine's picks. I don't always go with it. I just consult it.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, Brian, what does go into your decision? Is there a certain amount of times that eventually a CrossFit Games athlete cannot be eligible for most improved?
I'm actually not 100% sure what the criteria that CrossFit considers is. We were talking about this, that, you could take an example of someone who's made 5 or 6 games and they're always finishing 20th or below. And then all of a sudden, if they finish 8th at the games, like, are they in the conversation? That's a pretty significant improvement, especially after having 5 attempts and maybe never doing nearly that well. But on the flip side, it's like, well, if there's someone that's only been there once and then they make a significant improvement in year 2, that's a lot easier of a metric to say, like, yeah, this person has definitely improved by this much in this year. There's also the variable of if you miss a year. So there might be an athlete who didn't compete in 2021, or maybe they've even missed 2 years because 2020 was such a strange year. So the only data point we have from is 2019, like we had with Guy, where there were so many athletes in the field that the room for improvement is massive. So there's a lot of variables in play. But for me, generally, I would, if I move up from 30th to 20th and Tommy moves up from 20th to 10th, I'm giving it to Tommy because I think the higher up on the leaderboard you get, the harder it is to move up every single spot that you improve. And so even if those numbers were reduced and he only moved up 6 spots, but it was at a higher point on the leaderboard than my 8 spots, I would still most of the time favor Tommy in that scenario.
PC, what were some of the variables that you looked at?
Just the body of work. Brian brought up a lot of different aspects, but mine was more on that second point he brought up in terms of, you typically see a huge jump in athletes in terms of performance from their games appearance to their second year. If they make it back for a second, you usually see a huge jump because they've been there before. They've either changed their program, dieting, stuff like that. So that didn't take too much consideration, but it's more like a full body of work for me where, I look at some of these veterans who've been there in the past, who's consistently finished like 30th or, mid 20s. But if they make a big jump, then that's what I'm looking for from some of my picks.
And Tommy, what were the variables you looked at?
I don't disagree with either of those. I also think there's one element of consideration for me is based on the cut structure last year, that if athletes are able to break in from the top 20 into the top 20 from outside of, they're actually getting to finish the weekend. So for the first time, we're getting to see them compete more throughout the weekend, complete more events. And sometimes that visceral memory of getting to see an athlete more times on the floor almost supersedes what our expectations are for someone that's maybe an 11th. It sounds weird to say, but if someone is knocking on the door of a top 10, let's say Danielle Brandon, for example, and then she finishes 4th, you're like, okay, that's a natural progression. But if someone outside of my mind's eye that's in 26th, 27th, maybe 25th, suddenly jumps up to 12th or 13th, then that kind of has a larger impact on the competition as a whole now, because they're finishing the weekend. Now they're knocking on the top 10 and they weren't even in the consideration a year ago. So I don't disagree with the premise that Brian stated. I think sometimes it's not quite as clean.
All right. And speaking of that, Tommy, we like the little winks, but that's why you picked Sydney Mikulishin.
Yes. The 25th fittest woman from 2021. Who I think has a real possibility of getting inside that top 15. Everything I saw from her this season so far, it's just been a step forward in her progression, whether it was how comfortable she was out on the competition floor at the MAC, how she basically cruised to a second place finish behind Danielle Brandon, and really looked to be in control the entire weekend, being almost leading from the front the entire way. You look at the first half of her competition at the MAC, that second, sixth, first, it just looked like she was clicking. The MAC mile, she took 10th. It was the only finish even outside of the top, I believe the top 7, top 6 actually. And I think for someone that who came onto my radar because of some points that Brian brought up about her performance at Wadapalooza a couple years back. I think she's just someone who's going to benefit from the same metrics that Patrick brought up of having a year under your belt, kind of getting a feel for the flow and the speed of the games, kind of being at that next level to steal, an idiom from another sport. And with that in mind, I think she's able to really lean into and put together a few strong performances like she did at the MAC, knowing that she belongs. I don't see why she doesn't A, make the cut, and B, maybe put herself in the conversation for, that 13 to 10 spot at some point.
PC, moving to you, your pick was Jacqueline Dahlstrom.
Yeah. I'm also a big fan of her as well. She finished in the top 20, made the cut last year, but she's someone that's, the last 2 seasons, she hasn't been healthy. And this year, heading into this year, she committed herself fully to the program with her significant other and her coach, John Singleton, down there in Mallorca. But she's training with Gabby Magala. She's someone that just flies on the radar, but she won strength and depth in a pretty tough field. She didn't have a finish outside the top 6 in any of those events. And she's someone you don't really think of in terms of strength numbers, but she's really been working on her strength. And it kind of showed, at Dubai, when she finished I think in the top 5, but she didn't really, stand out, but she was still working on a lot of things in her game. And this year, it looks like she's finally got it all together. She's healthy. She's at a comfortable weight, because I think that's something that she struggled. She told me in a past interview that she was struggling with her weight, especially during COVID. But she's in a really comfortable spot. She's training alongside someone like Gabby, who's constantly pushing her. I definitely see her maybe cracking in that top 10. I wouldn't be surprised if she finishes between 8 and 5, because she just has a lot of tools that a lot of people just are sleeping on her, just sleeping on her altogether about.
All right, we'll see if those people wake up, PC.
Yeah. Wake up.
Wake up. Brian, finally, your pick for most improved this year, Ellie Turner.
Yeah, I think Ellie is a very similar athlete to Sydney McAlishan in this regard. She finished 26th last year, so she was 1 spot below Tommy's pick. And, she puts herself in that same conversation that he was alluding to, where if she's able to make the cut and have some relevant performances towards the back half of the weekend, that she can be very fresh in the mind. And as she moves up the leaderboard, it can also be really making an impact on people's mind relative to last year. I kind of just took a look at her competition performances, the last 3 major competitions she did, being the games, Wadapalooza, and then the semifinals. And I looked at the total body of work, and she had 15 workouts that I considered to be good or okay or better. So she basically was in the top 15 of the field, or maybe it was more of a percentage-based thing, but all those finishes were 15th or better, but some of the fields were a little bit deeper than others. She had 3 below average finishes, but she did have 5 workouts that I would consider bad finishes. So she's definitely got some things to work on. A lot of those are of the same kind of style of workout, and it's a style of workout that I do think will show up 2 to 3 times at the game. So I'm expecting her to have a couple, bad finishes still, especially relative to the games field. The question is, how bad will they be compared to what they were at those other competitions? Her semifinal was very competitive and difficult to qualify through. She did it at the expense of Maddie Sturt and Jamie Simmons, who both finished in the top 5 of the LCQ. And obviously the top 2 spots were basically untouchable in Tia and Cara. So just making it through there is really impressive. I think everyone knows at this point she's been training with Justin Medeiros for a few months now at least. And so she'll have some experience to lean on there in terms of success at the games. I think she's very much in the same conversation as Sydney, also just in terms of mental preparation and just, there's a lot of wide-eyedness, especially for young people at the games in those early years. I think both of them will take a big step in terms of maturity this year and confidence of just believing that I belong here and I can perform here and I can do well here. I think at Wodapalooza, we saw a little bit of that maybe battle for her. She had such a good start. She had a little bit of lull in the middle, but she did finish strong. So I think she's a good contender to move up potentially 10 to 15 spots this year.
Oh, wow. Who are some other names that you guys had in the mix that didn't
You mean
make
like
your...
some men, for example?
Yeah, I mean, we have a stack full of ladies that you think are going to run the show. What about the guys? Were there any names?
I'll just say this about the men's field. I think the men's field is lethal and brutal to try to make improvement in, because the only person who Scott Panchik obviously got injured. The only other person from the top 20 last year that didn't make it back is Royce Dunn. And when I look down the line there's not a lot of guys that I look at and I'm like, yeah, they're definitely worse than they were last year. In fact, it's the opposite. Almost every single one of them, I feel like I can make the argument for them to move up 5 spots this year. The problem is they can't all do that. So if you're looking at someone outside the top 20 to try to break in, I would look at someone like maybe an Alexander Caron, who had a second place at Wodapalooza and a third place at the Atlas Games. Maybe a Jay Crouch. He was just outside the top 20. He's getting better. He's been very consistent. No injuries, no setbacks. Great tutelage with Rob Forte. And after that, I don't know if there's anyone.
I'll throw a name out there, Willie George, who last competed in 2019. Obviously, he's been hurt all year, or last year, and then did compete in 2020. And he's looked really good. He won strength and depth. He looks 100% healthy. He did really well. I believe he finished 4th or 5th at Dubai. He's a guy who, he's had 2 previous games experience, top 10. I think finished 9th in 2018, but then finished 21st in 2019. Or sorry, 9th in 2018 and then 21st in 2019. Yeah, I think he's someone who has top 15, maybe top 12 potential, especially coming out of Europe. And then another person I'm actually keeping an eye on is Danny Spiegel. We got to see her. I mean, at least me and Brian were able to see her live at Granite Games, and she looked just so much better than it's like the best version of Danny Spiegel I've seen. And we know her past when it comes to games experience. She usually doesn't she's either hurt or she doesn't make the cut. This Danny Spiegel this version of her looks very fit. And I'm pretty sure she's pretty determined to, complete her games weekend. And not only that, but I also think she's one of those athletes, like if she makes it to certain events, she's a home run hitter. You have her in a strength event or some type of, gymnastics, handstand walk, she's going to do very well in as well.
Tommy, did you have any other runners up on the male or female side?
Yeah, that's an interesting position, because I think, it does bring up the question, like, all right, where's your runway for being most improved? Like, how many years do you have on your belt? Does something like finishing for like Willie, does finishing in the top 10, like kind of, the ebbs and flows disqualify you at some point? I think, and the Rube Goldberg machine actually gave us Colton Mertens, who was 31st last year. So, I mean, even if he finishes 20th or 21st, that's a double digit, improvement. So maybe man versus machine, the upper hand. But I think, like what Brian said, is a little bit more difficult to predict on the men's side, because you do look at some, like, even that did well last year, like Hopper, Hoppelin, and Uday. Like, are they going to crack the top 10 this year? Well, they will need to if they really want to be in consideration for most improved. So I think there's a lot more leeway for some of the young women last year that didn't make the cut overall. But yeah.
All right, Brian, what's your bottom line?
Well, I think my bottom line is that there are going to be some big movers. And I think especially on the women's side, we're going to see some move up the leaderboard quite a bit. But when it comes to most improved, it's one of those things that someone can oftentimes surprise you. So don't be surprised if there's maybe a less likely candidate that makes a big push for this.
PC, what's your bottom line?
Bottom line is, what you see is what you get in terms of most improved. It's going to have, we can sit here and make predictions all day, but basically they have to prove it out there. So it's going to unfold throughout the whole weekend, where one day you're like, oh my God, it looks so good. And next day they might not look so well and someone else will. So it's a very unique award to give out at the CrossFit Games, and I'm all for it.
Tommy, what's your bottom line?
I was gonna say that 12 is the lucky number, but I think we can all agree a baker's dozen is better than a dozen. So I think 13 is going to be our spots moved for. Everybody wants that that extra cookie in the batch for the on behalf of the baker. So I think 13 is going to be the lucky number.
Ooh, the unlucky number turned lucky. I like that. Thanks, guys. We'll see how this all pans out very soon, and we'll see you next time.